I'm Kurt Boone. I'm an author. And I write books about New York City. A few of my books are up here: Subway Beats, Asphalt Warrior, Fresh Plywood. Also, I recently did a book with this bookstore on the pandemic, Silence of the Pandemic, which is photo books about the empty streets in New York during the pandemic. I was a courier doing work, and while I was doing courier work, I photographed it. So, but also, I want to thank Joey. He's been a great host. I've done many events in the store, and it's a beautiful store. So if you love New York and New York books, the whole place is New York books. 90% of it is. So I advise you to come back, browse, or while you're here, come back and browse. And then Joey, he's the excellent manager in the back right there. Say hi, and so I'm gonna kind of get this going. So this is Gary Weiss, and I read about this book in the New York Times when it first came out. The review blew me away because I kind of grew up on Crazy Eddie and the commercials, and I didn't even realize I was really young. When I was seeing it in the 70s, in the 80s, I was almost like 12 years old when it first got going. So it was like, and then I moved to California when I was like 20. So I missed the whole corruption part of the story. But that said, the book is great. I love it. It goes into details about what was going on in the background, and I had no clue what was going on. So we want to kind of talk about that, and he's going to give us like an overview, and then I'll leave some time for questions and answers if you guys have any for Gary. So Gary, you grew up in the Bronx. Mm-hmm. Discuss like what it was like growing up in the Bronx at your time.
Well, I grew up in this. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me here. I really appreciate it. This is my first, and maybe it'll even be my only reading.
Oh, it's a great book.
Thank you, but hopefully there'll be more. But right now,
we'll see.
You got a corner on the market.
Okay, thank you. All right.
But I grew up in the Bronx, as you point out, as you correctly pointed out. I grew up in the Grand Concourse, and it was, I'll tell you, it was a very ordinary childhood. Well, I wouldn't say that. I take that back. But it was just a very ordinary neighborhood at the time by New York standards. It was sort of middle class. It was humdrum. There was a lot of immigrants. And that's how I could relate to the story in the book, because everybody over the age of 60 spoke with an accent. These were first or second generation immigrants from Eastern Europe. Some of them were World War II refugees, and never talked about it. Never. Only years later did I discover what it meant to be 50 years old and have an accent in the 1960s. But it was a very ordinary child. I went to City College, as did I went to Bronx Science, though I don't like to talk about that. I went to Bronx Science. I went to City College, and then I wrote the book. That sums up. That sums up
many books,
thing,
right?
yeah.
But were you a Yankee fan, or did you play stickball? Did you play any of the street games in the Bronx?
Not really, no. Oh, I probably should. I wish I had.
Yeah, okay, all right.
But I didn't.
You didn't, all right.
No, I wasn't very athletic. I was like I am today. I wasn't. I just wasn't. Except take out a few decades, and that was me. In other words, I don't play stickball now. I didn't play stickball then, but I should have. I wish I did.
You saw it for sure.
But I didn't.
You didn't. Okay.
Yeah.
So what got you into journalism? You went to City College, and then you went to Northwestern.
Northwestern.
Was you intrigued to be a journalist early on?
Well, I always used to read, when I was a kid, I used to read about the great journalists of World War II and Nazi Germany, covering Nazi, like William Shirer was I was probably the only kid at junior high school 45 who was constantly reading Berlin Diary, Ooh, it was so fascinating, because he really had a different take. Back in those days, journalists in Nazi Germany, some of them were pro-Nazi. It set him apart. He was a bit of a rebel. And, it appealed to me. His diary was really interesting. That kind of what got me into journalism. Even though I knew I had no facility with languages, I could never actually cover Nazi Germany. Of course, you didn't have Nazi Germany anymore. But I couldn't really be a foreign correspondent. But I did want to go into journalism, and that's kind of what I did.
Okay, so you landed at Business Week,
Yeah.
and you spent 18 years. 18
Yeah,
years
18
there.
years.
And did that kind of hone your craft to be this investigative reporter? And
Yeah.
how did you kind of get interested in Wall Street? A lot of people scared
Yeah.
to talk about Wall Street. You get in trouble about that stuff.
Well, I was, before Business Week, I was at Barron's for a while. I was
Okay.
writing about investments and whatever. So, you write about investments, you write about, people selling investments, and before you know it, you're writing about crime. Because, that's kind of like the way it was back in the 90s. It was just, there was a lot of improper activity going on in the markets. So in the mid-90s, I started writing about the mafia being involved in selling stocks. And that was like my, my big thing, back then.
Yeah.
And that's what led to my first book, Born to Steal. Which was
So
about
the mafia had their pockets in brokers, so brokers were doing kind of deals with the mafia to make money.
Yeah, well, kind of, the people have sometimes a misconception about the mafia that, that they're sort of like these alien implants who, they sort of descend like in flying saucers on companies, and they put their tentacles. No, they're very organic to whatever industry they happen to be involved in. They were involved, they had friends who were brokers, who were sometimes had gambling habits or drug habits, and they cut their hooks into these guys because they were selling them drugs or loaning them money. And they got their hooks into these guys, and before you know it, you had mobsters from all 5 families who were involved in Wall Street. Through sort of coming in on the ground level. By extorting brokers. There were a few who were really good, who had their own stock offerings. A fellow named Philip Bramo, some other guys in the Bonanno family who. They actually were so good. They actually had their own stock offering, companies that they had their own interests in, but that was rare. I mean, it was just sort of street level hoods.
Street level hoods, and so would they tell their broker to manipulate the stocks in certain ways, or behind the scenes?
Well, they take a cut.
They take a cut. Okay.
They take a cut, but if they had an interest in a company. Okay, if they had if they owned stock in a company, they would tell the people who were shorting the stock, meaning they were trying to profit by the stock price declining. They would tell people, you mustn't short this stock. You have to promote the stock, push the stock up, not push it down. You had some of that going on. This was taking place on the fringes of the market, but there was quite a lot of it back in the 90s, 80s.
Well, Michael Milkins was he there during that period of the mafia?
Ooh, he was in a different league.
He was in a different league.
Yeah, no, you can't really compare him to the mafia. He was really had his own little mafia in his own respect. He had his own. He had his own. His field was junk bonds. And it would take like 3 hours for me to describe exactly what he was doing, but it was completely different from what these mafia people were doing. But it still got him a racketeering indictment, and just as with some guy who's beating people up and shaking them down. That of course is the way it should.
Interesting. Very interesting time. My own experience in the 90s, I was a messenger for a rapid messenger service.
Yeah.
And one of the things we did, we would pick up every evening these booklets down on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And they were like little square like index cards. And I would take it to George Soros' apartment on Central Park West.
Okay.
So we were picking these things like every day. And I had no idea what was in them. All I knew was this is going to George Soros' apartment on Central Park West. Turned out to be this guy was like a billionaire, and he was really good at it.
Oh yeah.
So, but that was my closest I ever got to stock.
As close as you'd want to be.
All right, so let's kind of get into retail gangster. What led you to write this this beautiful story about Crazy Eddie.
Well, I personally was not a customer of Crazy Eddie, back when they had stores. I didn't generally like that kind of store, with the hard sell on television and all that. I would buy stuff on the gray market on Canal Street. I get into that. Eddie's the real competitor in the beginning was off-price stores that sold what they call gray goods. Stuff that wasn't really supposed to be sold in the U.S. It was supposed to be sold abroad, and they'd divert them to sell in the U.S.
Okay.
No, Eddie didn't do that. But how I got interested, gentleman is sitting right here, Sammy Antar, who was the whistleblower for Crazy Eddie. He kind of got involved in a sort of an area that I was involved in back around 15 years ago. I was looking at a guy called Patrick Boone, who now is a big election denier. He's big. In those days, he was pushing stock market conspiracy theories, basically. And Sam, who is here, Sam got interested in that, and he communicated with me, and I got to know Sam, and I got to know the story of Crazy Eddie through Sam and through the Antar, through the Antar family, and that's how I kind of got interested. I was aware of Crazy Eddie. I mean, I knew that it existed, obviously, and I knew that it was a fraud, and that people went to prison. But I didn't. That's about all I knew.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because it was in the news, right? When the fraud was coming out, right?
Sure. Yeah. It was a big story in New York in the '80s.
Right. So
90s.
let's maybe start where you start off. Syrian Jewish immigrants, Crazy Eddie family. Let's tell me a little bit about that and your investigation, because I thought that was like the foundation of kind of like the book and the story. Can you say a little bit about that, the Syrian Jewish community?
Sure. Well, as I was mentioning earlier, I came from a family of a neighborhood and a family of immigrants. My grandparents were immigrants. I grew up in an immigrant neighborhood, and similarly, Eddie Antar, the founder of Crazy Eddie, he was like myself, the grandson of immigrants. But the difference was that the Syrian Jewish community, certainly at that time, it stuck sort of closer to the origins. In many respects, in terms of the culture, and in terms also of the kind of occupations that people were involved in. Among people of my sort of generation, Jewish people who came out of Eastern Europe, it was a great desire to assimilate, to get an education, to assimilate. To get into journalism. Now, mind you, that does happen among Syrian Jewish people, and it's Jewish people have succeeded tremendously. But for back in the mid-century, 20th century, the Syrian Jewish community stayed a little bit closer to retail, and retailing was still a big thing through like the 70s, 60s, 70s. Grandfathers would fathers would hand down to their sons, the mercantile tradition, and also would set up their kids in business. And this is how Eddie Antar got into business. He was set up in business by his father, who was the son of Murad Antar, who came from Aleppo, Syria, and he was set up in business on King's Highway in Brooklyn. And Eddie had previously worked in these tourist traps on Times Square and vicinity, and that's kind of where he learned his trade, kind of.
Yeah.
And so he was set up in business in King's Highway, and King's Highway is in the middle of Brooklyn. It's very, it's a little bit like where I grew up. It's a middle-class neighborhood, and people are not foolish, they're not stupid, they're not tourists like in Times Square. They're good customers.
Okay.
They're not gonna be ripped off like the tourists were on Times Square. So they set him up in an electronics store, because electronics was the hot thing back then. An electronics store, and Eddie realized, look, I'm not selling to these people. They're not buying. He realized he had to discount, and that's where he ran into a real problem, because the manufacturers didn't want to sell to discounters.
And they had laws, right? You can't sell at a discount, and you could. But now, was that a legal kind of law? Or was it a trade kind of?
Oh, it was legal. It was actually they were allowed to enforce price fixing, what they called vertical price fixing, where they could tell where the manufacturer of an electronic product like Sony could tell a store not to sell at less than the list price of merchandise. And then they call that fair trade, which is ironic. It wasn't fair, but this is what they call it. So Eddie was faced with this, and he realized, look, he has to figure out a way. If he's going to drive customers to Kings Highway, go all the way out to Kings Highway, how is he going to do that when he can't charge less than
his competitors?
Yeah, than his competitors. And he figured out a way. He was good in many respects.
Yeah, I saw that. It's in the book how he kind of developed that instinct to figure out that way. So Eddie, so Eddie Antar, for the audience, he is Crazy Eddie, but he's not Crazy Eddie, the one you saw on television. And we will get into that. So Jerry Carroll was the character doing the advertising, but the actual Crazy Eddie wasn't really around in front of the store. He was behind the scenes, organizing everything. But let's go into the family business as Eddie gets a store for himself, and he learns this craft. It's of skimming money off the top.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a word you have. How do you say it?
I think it's about Nekti.
Nekti.
Nekti. I think that's right, Sam, right?
Is that
Nekti.
right?
Sam
Nekti?
is in the audience.
Sam is
one of the
he's
characters.
featured in the book. Yeah.
He's in the book?
Yeah, so
I think about
Nekti is what you call it.
Nekti,
But so
Nekti.
he got this early on from the family structure of skimming profits from
Yes.
from the store, not reporting taxes on
Right.
it, right? And stashing that money away.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's been done for generations by all kinds of immigrant merchants. The Syrian immigrants were into that as well, where they would skim cash to avoid paying taxes. Now skimming cash itself is, if it's for the purpose of not paying taxes, it's not really legal. It's not legal. You're not supposed to do that.
Okay.
But they did it. And also they would pay their employees in cash, which was good for them because they didn't have to pay payroll taxes. And of course the employees were paid off the books. So their employees usually said, oh, wow, I don't have to pay taxes on this. So everybody was happy, except the government, and they didn't know. So they were happy too. So everybody's happy.
Wow. So it becomes like a trade for Eddie.
Yeah.
To use that technique.
Exactly.
And he scaled it to another level.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he was sending money. Well, I mean, later on, the amount of Nekti, the skimmed cash, which initially was just stuffed into ceilings, Initially, it became the center of this very sophisticated, though simply principled, money laundering operation, which became sort of at the center of the scam. But we're getting ahead of the story.
All right, great.
That'll
great.
be later.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring that family tradition.
That's
but
important.
It wasn't just him. It was other immigrants as
Yeah,
well. All
it
right.
was everybody.
Okay.
Everybody did.
So I was fascinated about the electronic youth culture and how that was blossoming. And 80 saw it coming, right? He saw this electronic culture growing among young people, and he wanted to be there for that growth. And so now he was working for his father, and eventually he gets his own store, right?
Yeah, right. Well, his father was set him up with a store in Kings Highway, as I was mentioning. When he was turning 21, he was getting married. He was going to become a solid citizen. So he set him up in the store on Kings Highway, and he was in partnership with the father, Sam M. Antar. A lot of Sams in the store.
Right, a lot of Sams. Yeah.
Antar and his cousin. Gindy, so ERS, Ronnie Gindy, Eddie, Ronnie, and Sam, it was called initially ERS Electronics. He had a third interest in the store. Eventually, he took over the whole operation. But it was a real family operation. There was an intricate set of deals that resulted in the creation of the store, which I point out because it sort of shows how interconnected the family was with each other, and also how the family was very important. Among the Syrian Jewish communities, and still is, to an extent that's sort of been lost, I think, among a lot of other immigrant groups, because people help each other. They employ each other. They support each other in times of distress, and yeah, that's good.
That's good.
There's
No.
nothing wrong with that. That's good. But when there's a criminal element to it, when people are involved in illegal activities, that can also be turned around to become kind of this sort of family criminal, sort of this Corleone family type culture. And that's what happened with Eddie. It began as sort of in a sort of benign way, as, oh, well, people helping each other and so forth. And then, in a few years, it degenerated into the criminal family, criminal enterprise.
But they didn't see themselves as that. Not it's the way you wrote it. It was more that was their livelihood. But the customers didn't know, right? This was all kind of like behind the scenes as they were developing this kind of criminal enterprise. And as you said, Eddie had 1/3. And what was fascinating is when they skimmed the cash, each of them would get 1/3 of that cash. So it was a interesting system that built up. And then eventually, Eddie gets his own store, and he's selling consumer electronics, and then he comes up with the idea of marketing the store outside the neighborhood.
Right.
Because I believe a lot of the locals weren't buying.
They didn't.
They said, "Nah, this guy."
Well, they had no reason to buy. They had no reason to buy from Eddie Antar's little store on Kings Highway because they could go into Midtown Manhattan and buy from Gimbals or wherever that was back then, or some audio store. Why? And he wanted to attract people from Manhattan to come to Brooklyn who were going to whatever Polk Electronics, or whatever the hell the stores were back then, 47th Street Electronics. He wanted to attract people to go to Brooklyn. Now, why would anybody want to take the subway all the way into Brooklyn? It's a 40-minute ride or an hour ride. Why would you want to do that and then walk? Because, it wasn't directly on the subway line. Why would you want to do that if you can just go to Manhattan, go someplace else? And he figured out the way. He came up with this really brilliant advertising pitch, which was borrowed from Lord knows where. It was to present himself, and it's hokey. It's been around forever. But to present himself, he said, "Oh, I'm so insane that I will sell at less than cost," and that kind of thing. So the crazy merchant. It's been around forever, but he did it better than anybody else. And then, in the mid-'70s, he hired Jerry Carroll.
Well, to Larry Weiss.
Through a guy named Larry Weiss, no relation.
Oh, to you, okay.
To a guy like, no relation. Larry Weiss is a very common name.
Yeah, Larry Weiss.
It's a very common. But he hired, through the mid-'70s, he hired this guy Larry Weiss who brought in Jerry Carroll, who was a disc jockey, WPIX-FM, and he was perfect. Now he had these. And it resulted in these iconic TV and radio commercials. And, our prices, I can't do it well. I'm not going to imitate
no one can do it.
It's all over the internet.
Yeah, it's all.
That worked.
That worked, right?
Worked beyond anyone's wildest dream.
Well, then wasn't it, he was doing the newspapers, but when he did TV late at night, it was almost free.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It was like $10 a spot.
Yeah, it was $10. Well, see, they came up with that idea. They hired this guy. They brainstormed. They realized, well, look, if we advertise all night, there were all these TV spots available overnight, okay? And they were cheap as anything, like $10, $15 to advertise. It was really cheap. And even though they didn't get many viewers, they could saturate the airwaves at night.
At night.
Yeah, and they did, from midnight to dawn. They were constant crazy.
Yeah.
So they figured it's better to have 30 people bombarded with 1,000 ads than 1,000 people bombarded with 30 ads, or something like that. And the idea is to really, even though it's a small, not a big audience, let's really saturate the airwaves at night, and that's precisely what they did. In addition to making some very savvy purchases of commercial time of TV shows that were relevant, which they felt were good picks, like a show that was on that time called Mary Hartman.
Yeah.
Most people here, I don't think remember. Well, maybe some would. But Mary Hartman was, this very popular TV show back in the 70s. Which spoofed consumer culture.
Yeah.
So they bought Mary Hartman, TV spots on Mary Hardin.
No, it was brilliant. So the business grows, right? He's on Kings Highway now. He's making money.
Yeah.
And he decides to open up another store,
Yeah.
and it kept growing, right? And it kept skimming the cash,
Right.
right? So the way he was able to do that, eventually the law about fair trade got overturned, right?
Yeah, right. It was overturned in, I think, 76.
In 76. So
yeah.
now he can sell at whatever price he wants.
Yeah.
And he started doing these schemes of getting customers in, not making money, but kind of like taking the money off the top and not kind of being his profit and not really making money on the inventory. If I got that right?
Well, sort of,
Just to advance the business too.
Yeah, even before they overturned fair trade, what they used to do is because they had all these great competitors, and they were advertising in the Village Voice, they used this crazy motif, like how are they going to claim that they are selling products at less than wholesale? What they used to do was, as you point out, they would skim. They would skim, they would skim profits, actually, skim profits. They also, when they sold products, they would collect sales tax, like every legitimate businessman is supposed to. In those days, I think it was 7.5% or something like that. They would sell, you sell something for $100, you collect $107, just like you're supposed to. But they didn't pass on that $7 to the tax authorities. They would keep it. They would keep it. So they figured out that, well, look, I mean, we're collecting $107 for this product. Let's say it's $100. Let's say it's a stereo they're selling for $100. It would be more like $200, but whatever it is. They collect because they've got this built-in, profit margin. This sales tax that they're collecting, but not turning over to the government. They use that. This enabled them because they were collecting sales tax. They were able to actually charge less than their competitors, less than wholesale, sometimes less than cost, because they had this 7% built-in wiggle room, built-in cushion. This $7 per 100, say, that enabled them to actually sell under
wholesale,
under cost.
Yeah, under cost. Yeah. And that worked. It worked. And they grew their business significantly. So as they grow and they got Jerry Carroll, the business grows and they start kind of thinking about going public.
Right.
Let's make more money. Let's sell stock to the public. And that was kind of like an interesting endeavor there. Could you speak about as they grew? It was around, how many stores did they have? Around 15, 16 before they went public?
Yeah, I guess something like that. Yeah, they had maybe a dozen, maybe fewer. I don't recall offhand. It's probably in here, but who wants to go through all this? At the peak, they had 43 stores. At the peak.
Okay.
At the peak. But around the time they went public, they had, I don't know, maybe about a dozen or fewer. I don't know. How many would you recall, Sam? How many they had? Was that again?
12.
About 12? 12. Right.
12.
I have an expert sitting here. Why should I not utilize?
He's the accountant.
He's the accountant. If he doesn't remember, nobody's going to remember.
That's why he's the accountant. So
let me
ask you,
they had
who
a real.
came up with the idea to go public? I know you mentioned, was it Eddie or the family?
They all wanted to go public because it was a big thing back then. It still is a big thing back then. But back in the 80s, during the Reagan years, they passed tax laws that made it very, very lucrative to go public and to sell stock and so forth and so on. So everybody wanted to go public. That was the golden goose. I think that's the correct word. But Sam, who's right here, he came up with a great idea. They were skimming money, right?
Yeah.
They were skimming money. They were skimming profits, mind you. Not just skimming, they were skimming profits. And he came up with the idea, well, look, you're skimming profits, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because you're taking profits out of the company. But if you want to go public, you want to make it seem that you've got a lot of profits. You're awash in profits, and not only that, your profits are growing. So how do you make believe that your profits are growing? You do that by taking out, well, you're taking money out. Well, take out less and less and less and less, and it makes it seem, wow, you've got a growing company.
Okay.
So as a result of the reduction in the skim, which took place between approximately 1980 and 1984, something like that, they were able to turn a genuine profit increase during like one of those time periods of like 3%, and they were able to make it like 25%. I'm just doing this off the top of my head, but they massively inflated the growth of the profits of their company by reducing the amount of skim which they were taking out, and they used to stuff it into mattresses and so forth, but they started sending it over to Israel,
Right.
and they were sending less and less to Israel. And it was brilliant, it was absolutely brilliant because they really connived, they conned everybody.
Yeah, the public
Nobody
didn't know.
caught this. No, the
It was
public
a
didn't know.
securities fraud by going legit.
Yeah, securities fraud by going legit.
Okay, okay.
Because after all, they're committing tax fraud, but the idea being, look, you're committing tax fraud, okay, by stealing, by skimming this money. But why not commit securities fraud? It's much more lucrative. You can really leverage. Even though you'll be taking out less money, you'll be literally overpaying taxes because you're overstating your profits. You're going to be overstating taxes. Big deal. The amount of your stock's going to go up like this. And who owns the stock?
The family.
The family. So that's how it works.
That's how I get going. So
Yeah. And
now
they
the
were-
stock, the period of the stock exchange when I was reading it didn't seem that long. Maybe 83, 84 to 80, 87. It was just,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff was going on in that time period
Yeah.
that you was writing about, especially reporting profits each quarter.
Yeah.
Because every quarter there was like I won't say a new scheme, but they had this the inventory
Yeah.
manipulation scheme.
Well, you see, after they went public, which was in '84, in August of '84, they had to satisfy Wall Street. I mean, they didn't really think through all the implications of being public. And one of the implications of being public is that you had to satisfy Wall Street, you had to satisfy analysts, the
Right.
press, the public, that. You had to satisfy all these people. How are you going to satisfy these people? You just inflated your profits. You got to continue to inflate your profits. So they figured out other ways of inflating their profits. They had done this skim reduction. Okay,
Right,
that's how they
right.
got it. Got
That's
them
how
through
they
the
got
front.
it.
It got them through the front door. Well, now they started to do more. Falsification of their profits because they continue. Because see, Eddie started to sell stock. He was the biggest shareholder. You see,
Yeah.
he started to sell stock and sell stock. And in order to sell at a good price, he needed to make the company look great, So in order to con people into thinking the company was great, he had to manipulate profit. He had to inflate profits, which he did in several ways, which were really pretty simple. They sometimes seem complicated, but they were really pretty simple. And one of the things he used to do was to inflate the value of what was in his warehouses. He'd tell a warehouse guy, look, could you please inflate the warehouse quantity in the warehouse? And most people don't know that when you inflate what's in a warehouse, you are increasing the profits of the company. Most people don't know, and that's because there's a financial formula which goes into making financial statements, which takes into account what's in your warehouse. And most people don't know
Yeah,
this.
right. You only get busted when the auditors come, right?
That's right.
So but we'll get to that later.
Well,
Yeah.
not the auditors, but the new owners. The auditors never caught it.
The auditors
Oh,
don't-
no.
So, okay.
But that's going. We're ahead of the story.
Let's go way ahead and start. You're right.
Yeah, it's still ahead of us.
So
That's coming.
So they go public. The stock goes up, and he starts selling.
And he starts selling. Yeah, that's
starts selling, making money.
He's making money, and of course,
making money.
and by the way, when you sell stock, knowing that you're running a fraudulent company, that is insider trading. And the government takes a very dim view. They've always taken, even when they wink at everything else, the government has always taken a dim view of insider trading. And he was insider trading like it was going out of style.
Yeah, he was.
Oh, he was going.
What I didn't get, it's like the family. So Sam M. his two brothers, they're all a part of this, right?
Yeah,
and they're
well-
not saying anything. They're just accepting it, taking the money, buying houses, and just living wealthy, knowing that
Yeah.
this is a scheme.
Well, Sam M. was the patriarch of the family, going into this. He wasn't all that old when Eddie went public. He was, well, by my standards, he wasn't that old. He was in his 60s, which I don't think is real.
That's not what I'm saying.
I don't think it's old. You
No,
better
I'm
not.
60, yeah.
But he wasn't that old.
Right.
And here was this kid who was making him look like a fool. His kid was, Eddie was in his 30s, and he's surpassing his father now. No father likes that. Certainly not Sam M. Antar with an ego, the size of the Empire State Building. They hadn't built the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it became a real source of problems between the father and the son. That and the fact that Eddie, as a human being, oh my, was he a bum.
He's a character.
He was a bum.
He's a character,
as
man.
Ralph Cramden would say. He was a louse in a personal way toward his brothers, toward his children, toward his wife. Toward his
Wife
wife.
story
He
is
was a
incredible.
wife abuser.
The wife
He
story.
was a wife beater.
Yeah.
He was a real bum, and he gave his father a heart attack. He was.
He called people a piece of shit. He was a piece of shit.
He was a piece of shit. Yeah, he really was. I mean, he treated everybody, and he was not even an intelligent. He had a terrible temper, and he lost his perspective on maintaining a criminal enterprise, because you can't really be an overt piece of shit, as you point out, as you artfully pointed. You can't be that overt if you're running a criminal enterprise. You need the loyalty of people, and everybody started to hate him. His father, his brothers, everybody. And it became because he didn't treat them right. I mentioned earlier about the Syrian traditions.
Right.
The family, people helping each other and so forth. Well, he did help his family. He did employ a lot of members of his family, but he didn't really give them the share of the wealth that they had come to expect. And he didn't really. There was a lot of rivalry within the family. And a lot of it may sound petty in retrospect, because it was petty. But this resulted in the crumbling of the Antar Empire. And one of the people he treated very badly was sitting in our audience today, Sam E. Antar, his cousin, who had thought up this terrific idea of reducing the skim, which, after all, this is how they went public. This is how Eddie was able to engage in all this wonderful insider trading, right? Sam E. Antar, the accountant, became as things started to collapse, and he was treated poorly, and the government started to hone in on him, because, after all, he was the chief accountant. And you kind of expect, if there's a lot of fraud going on, that the chief accountant's going to know about it.
Yeah.
They started to hone in on him, and Eddie, go away.
Right.
That's not the way you treat a co-conspirator. You want your co-conspirator to be, he's going to protect him. And he said, no, I don't want to. You wouldn't even give him a cent in legal fees. There he is, lying like hell before various government bodies, being sued by everybody in creation. This is after everything collapsed. I'm getting a little ahead of the story, but it all has to do with the family. And he wouldn't. He wouldn't help.
And there's a whole thing about his wife and the divorce.
Yeah, there was a big thing with it.
But also, to stay about Zazie and cutting checks, he was cutting checks for $5 million, $6 million, whatever the profit loss was. He would cut a check, and it was a check for inventory, right? It wasn't like they sold it.
Yeah, well,
how was it? What was it
yeah,
like?
that goes back to as we were discussing about how he inflated profits. Zazie was a wholesaler, and he actually sold to Zazie. He sold to a wholesaler. Zazie should not be confused, by the way, with this excellent pizza joint by that name of the West Village. Totally coincidental. No, Zazie was this little outfit on 6th Avenue and 24th. It was a wholesaler, and in order to, one of the schemes he had to inflate profits, which Sam and engaged in, was to sell to Zazie and they would book the sales in such a way as to goose the earnings. And they engaged in that. They engaged in something called debit memos.
Debit memos, yeah.
There was something called debit memos, which are basically they were just these things you write out saying, here, I'm owed money by Sony, and as soon as you write it, you've made profits. But it was phony. They weren't owed any
paper,
money.
right?
It was just paper. But this is that was the kind of thing that they used to do to inflate profits.
And so Eddie's like the chairman. And
Yeah.
Is he directing all this?
Oh yeah. That was the only thing he cared about. On Italy was the fraud. The only thing he cared about was the stock price. The only thing that elevated the stock price was the fraud, really, more than anything. Particularly as things were going on and on and on, and in the 80s there was starting to be real competitors. They got rid of the fair trade, so they started to get some competitors, real competitors.
Yeah, we remember the Newman commercial. Yeah.
Sure,
That's a great commercial.
They had all these other competitors would come in, try to take over, eat his lunch.
Eat his lunch, yeah.
So to speak.
Right.
And Eddie was under some real competition, and he had to commit more fraud in order to make up for that competition.
So he's growing business, committing fraud,
Yeah.
opening new stores.
Yeah.
It's so much unreal that he's doing all this in front of everybody, and no one really kind of knows except the family.
Yeah.
How is that? Were they still? I think grew to like 25 stores. Was he still
40,
paying
right?
them more than that? But was he still paying the employees with cash or checks?
No. After a while, he wasn't paying. With a few exceptions, he was no longer paying people in cash.
Okay.
And the payments generally, they started to have. They had the real trappings of a legitimate company
like
after they were public.
all right.
Yeah, they weren't paying people off the books for the most part anymore. But the reason no one really knew what was happening was, first of all, Eddie kept the fraud circle kind of tight. So the people involved in the marketing, like Jerry Carroll, for instance, they didn't know about any of that stuff. And how could they? This was going on in warehouses. Well, they know about warehouses, and the sales floor didn't really know about it. They only knew about what was going on the sales floor, which wasn't entirely kosher, But it wasn't, what was going on in the way. It wasn't securities fraud, Oh no.
Well, the sales floor was reporting back to Eddie's management team that
Yeah.
they didn't have to stop. They were reporting
Yeah.
they had to stop on the spreadsheets.
Yeah.
But when they went to find it, it wasn't there.
Yeah, which could have been because they were sloppy. They didn't. The people in the sales floor were sticking to their knitting. They
Okay.
were selling. They were. That's what they were doing. And
Yeah.
Eddie was, and Jerry Carroll was selling. But the people who should have known were the auditors, and they didn't know, and they were dumb as dust. They were horrible, and needless to say, the securities regulators, until the very, 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 very end, did not have any idea of what was happening. You get it. You can carry out a fraud like that. You have to carry out a fraud like that through secrecy, and there was generally secrecy until the company was taken over. Then that blew the lid off the company. But while the fraud was going on, they had secrecy, and they had very, very good public relations. It was very hard to believe that Crazy Eddie was involved in fraud because he had all these funny commercials.
He had a positive image, yeah.
He had a great image, and he had a wonderful PR guy working for him.
Was that Collington, right?
Yeah, a fellow named Ed Collington, who was this old drunk. He was able to. He did a really good job until the end, when he got sloppy and arrogant. Until the end, he did a really good job of keeping the fraud from becoming public knowledge. When the company was finally taken over, as happens, one of the things that happens when you sell stock to the public is anybody can buy it. Somebody can accumulate the stock and take over your company. And if they take over a company that's committing fraud, they're going to find out
Right.
that it's
that's
fraud.
Right. That is fraud.
That there's a lot of fraud going on, which is exactly what happened in 1987. They took over the couple of absolutely unlucky, the unluckiest. I don't want to use any more pejorative. They're both alive. I don't want to use anything more pejorative than unlucky. Two of the unluckiest takeover artists in the history of American business took over Crazy Eddie. And then when they did, they realized the warehouses don't have what they're supposed to, and this is wrong, and that's wrong, and this is wrong. You know, the new chief financial officer who took over with Sammy Antar,
Yeah.
he goes into Sam's former offices in Edison, New Jersey. He goes into I think it's Edison, New Jersey. He goes into his offices, and it's empty, bare to the walls. You know, this is supposed to be a public company with a lot of going on, and there's an empty office. Where are all the files? The files were all missing. You know, he sort of knew when that happened that this is not kosher. This is not.
Well, you know, before you got to that point, there was a run-up to that. That wasn't immediate, right? It took constant investigating and what you would say cooking the books.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Until the bitter end, right? So they cooked the books
Right.
every quarter.
Right.
And it took years and years
Exactly.
before they even caught up to what he was doing, you know. And so
once
cooking
they,
the books was interesting, and as you know, like Sammy, the guy is here who cooked the books,
Right.
What was your take, you know, on that? Or maybe I should ask Sammy, but what cooking the books was like, because they definitely cooked those books for a couple of years before.
Well, it was a bunch.
SEC came
It was a
down.
bunch of schemes, you know. First beginning with one thing sort of led to the other. You know, first you had the skim being reduced, and then you had those debit memos, then the warehouse inflation, and then they had this. Then they had the warehouser. They had Zazie buying stuff and
Right.
those putting in there. They had these whole bunch of schemes. It was one after the other, and what are the things they had to do, for instance? Toward the end, you know, people were checking out how the individual stores are doing, comp store sales. You got a dozen stores.
Right.
So, you know, are the sales growing because they're opening up more stores, or are they growing because there's more activity in the stores? So that's called. They track that. They're called comp store sales are tracked. So. Comp store sales were lousy, obviously, at Crazy Eddie. So they had to figure out, well, how are we going to improve our comp store sales? Well, they still had some stimmed cash over in Israel, you see. Eddie had some stimmed cash, family members did. So let's bring in some, you know, they had been, you know, skimming it. Let's bring in some of that skim cash and let's stuff it into the store accounts, almost like into the cash registers of these individual stores. You know, so they did that through Israel, through Panama, and it became known as the Panama Pump. Among fraud aficionados, they call it the Panama Pump. They would pump cash into individual stores in order to make it seem as if these stores were doing just terrific. They were just doing great, but they weren't. They were just simply getting cash from Israel through Panama. That was called the Panama Pump. It's a form of money laundering. And that's the kind of thing that they were doing up to the time that these two very unlucky individuals, one was named Victor Palmieri, he was a very reputable gentleman. He used to be a State Department official or something, you know. He was a immensely intelligent man. Probably still is an immensely intelligent man. Still alive. And this guy called Elias Zinn, who operated discount stores in Texas. In Texas. Elias Zinn, a younger fella. You know, another very reasonably intelligent man. And they were both completely hoodwinked by Eddie. They bought this hunk of... you can use an expletive there. You see, and they bought this.
A piece of something.
And you know, they came in. And, you know, and that
but
was
the
that.
market, the stock was, you could be actually fooled by it because they did a number of stock splits.
Yeah.
And did the stock actually go up to like $88 almost?
Yeah, the stock went up enormously over the period of time that they were public, and then it started to collapse.
Right, so it started opening at like $7 or $8.
Yeah, and then it went to something like 80, 85, something like that. I'm just guessing.
But
it's
Eddie,
in here, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's in there. But Eddie would, when it would go up really large, he would sell the stock.
Well, yeah,
Just make a lot of money. So he sent a lot of money to Israel, almost $50 million.
Yeah, he sent a lot of money to Israel. That was when before he fled. But you see, before he sold stock, he had to be sure that the stock price was going to go up. So, they had what you call secondary offering. In other words, they were selling. They actually had actual offerings. They were selling chunks of stock on Wall Street. So what Eddie used to do is they used to ensure that the financial statements prior to the stock sales, the planned stock sales, were really nice looking. Financial statements, which they were able to effectuate through various fraud schemes, involving, pumping money into, through Panama and all this other stuff that I've been talking about.
So in other words, they did the IPO was say $5 million.
Yeah, whatever.
So, okay, they say, oh, we're going to do another initial, not an IPO, but a second offering.
A second offering.
And offer another 5 million shares.
Something like that. Something like that.
And how many did he do? How many offerings? He did a bunch, right?
Oh, he sure did. He did a lot. He sold a lot of stock. Millions and millions of stock. Sam may have an exact number if he recalls.
Four offerings.
Four offerings. He did a lot of offerings. Some of them were not stock. Some of them were debentures. Debentures. What's a debenture? It's a thing. It's like a stock, only it's fancier. It doesn't matter really. He just was selling and selling, and in order to sell, he had to inflate.
Yeah.
And that's really what the book is about.
Right.
In terms of the criminal aspects, it's inflate and sell.
And
that's
the public
what it's
is
all
still
about.
seeing the commercial coming to the stores. And all this is
Absolutely.
going on.
Nobody knew it. It was still going on. They were still getting favorable publicity as they were collapsing. Even after word of the fraud started to leak out, it was still, under new management, they kept on Jerry Carroll, and they still had these great commercials and whatever, and the public didn't really pay attention, nor should they have. What do they care?
But they kind of loved them. The public loved them because of the commercials, right? Yeah. So that was interesting in itself, even though he was a nasty dude behind the scenes.
Yeah, he sure was. Yeah.
So. We do have the president of SAM and here with the SEC investigation. He was like one of the central characters in that, talking about how all these frauds were going on.
Yeah.
And he spilled a lot of beans.
Well, not initially. After,
First, not.
Yeah, you see,
he did. I think he said 2 lies under oath.
Excuse me?
He did 2 lies under oath when.
Oh,
the
he
SEC
lied.
So he did about 2. How many did he do?
1,000 pages of lies.
He did 12,000 pages of lies. Okay.
He lied. I mean, he admits it now. After the company collapsed, after the company was taken over, shall we say, and after the jig was up, you see, old management was subpoenaed by the SEC, Sammy Antar. They attempted to get Eddie to testify, but they couldn't find him. But they got people to testify. Sam E. kind of was delegated by Eddie to, be the field marshal of the fraud, kind of the fraud cleanup. So
Chief financial officer.
he went out to he was chief. He was the financial. Anyway, he came to Washington and he testified falsely day after day after day, and had other people who were involved in the fraud testify, day after day falsely. And as I mentioned earlier. While this was happening, while he was, bearing the brunt of the federal, and he was being sued. Oh my God! Everybody was suing everybody else.
All right.
After the company was taken over, he was being sued. He had legal fees. When you're sued, you have legal fees. You got to hire a lawyer, whether you like it or not. So you have thousands and thousands of dollars of legal fees. It wasn't entirely all for himself, but as sort of the family's chief. Chief spokesperson in a criminal sense.
Because Eddie disappeared.
Eddie had disappeared. Before the company was sold. He realized. Look, as things started to collapse, Eddie realized that he can't hang around. He was intelligent enough to realize that this is eventually going to collapse. So he started to make preparations to flee the country, which is what he did. He started sending millions of dollars over to Israel, of his own personal funds, sending millions of dollars over to Israel, and he started to make preparations to emigrate to Israel, which is what he eventually did after the company was taken over in 1988.
Yeah, well, I'm going to spend some time on him being a fugitive. I guess we can do it now. So when he went to court was it for court for his wife lawsuit against him, or he went to court for something else and didn't show? What was it? Because he was supposed to show
Yeah.
for something, and then they issued the warrant for him to show. And
Yeah.
I wasn't like I read it, but I wasn't sure. Was it for the wife?
Well, at the time, yeah.
Divorce, or was it for the SEC investigation when he skipped court?
Well, what happened was that after the company was taken over and after the fraud was discovered, that's when the SEC finally their head was shoved into the mess. They finally realized, because it was spoon fed to them by new management, that this company was a fraud. So they launched an investigation, and they sued, and they subpoenaed, and the upshot was that they discovered through information that, this is skipping ahead a little bit through the story, but Sam here was starting to cooperate with the government. They discovered that Eddie had shipped some money to Israel, and they discovered through litigation that Eddie was involved with his wife. He had divorced his wife, and naturally he ripped her off. Mm-hmm. So there was litigation between Eddie and his wife, and in this litigation, and through some information that Sam E. Antar had provided, his cousin had provided, they came to realize that $50 million or so dollars had been shipped off to Israel. And the judge, the SEC, got authority from the government to get the money back, to get the money, bring the money back. He was subpoenaed to appear before a judge in Newark, New Jersey. He did not, and he was placed in contempt of court. At about that point, he fled. He absconded. That's about the point that he absconded.
Okay, he became that fugitive.
He became a fugitive.
Because the judge issued the fugitive one.
Yes.
And interesting that how long did he stay in Israel? About 2 years, right? They found him, right?
Yeah.
86?
Well, he emigrated, I believe it was in 1988, if memory serves right. He emigrated in 1988, legitimately. You see, Eddie never did anything straight. Everything had to be crooked. Eddie emigrated in 1988, and it's legal to emigrate. No, he emigrated. He was not under indictment. There's nothing wrong with that. He emigrated, and at the same time that he emigrated under his real name, he became a citizen of Israel under a phony name. He believed that by immigrating, he would be, accepted by the Israeli community, and they would prevent him from being extradited, But the Israelis didn't like it when they learned that he had emigrated that he had become not only a citizen under his own name, but a citizen under a phony name. They really didn't like that. Countries don't generally like it when you create phony identities and make them citizens. Israel in particular, because of their security consciousness. So when the United States government finally found that he was in Israel, they had a lot of cooperation from the Israeli government.
Yeah, because he was trying to show love to Israel. Israel wasn't.
No, some way to show love,
Yeah.
to make your alias, to make your sock puppet, your alias a citizen under they have two citizenships. You're only allowed one citizenship per person is all that's allowed.
So the FBI found out because the original went there on his real name.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, when he applied for citizenship, he had two names. He had a Brazilian name, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah. He applied under phony Brazilian citizenship.
Yeah.
When he became a citizen under his real name, it didn't really raise hackles too much. It was all very quiet, and he didn't get a lot of publicity. But you see, after he became a citizen under this phony name, he then went to Switzerland and fought with the Swiss authorities over one of his bank accounts. Now, this became known to the United States government because, you see, he was under a misapprehension. Eddie thought that everything that happened between him and the Swiss banks that he had accounts at, everything would be kept confidential. Sort of like in the James Bond movies.
Yeah.
That it would be completely. That's not the way it really is.
Yeah.
They don't keep things confidential. The
Yeah.
U.S. government found out, and they found that he had this ridiculous phony name, Jacob Levi Cohen. That had opened an account in Brazil, in Switzerland, and it had the same birth date as Eddie Antar, December 18th, 1947. So that's a common mistake that fugitives make, is using their real birth date in opening phony accounts, and that's exactly what Eddie did.
Now, 50 million, how much is that today? Would that be 100 million, 200 million?
Well, I don't know.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, and that was just a little fraction of his wealth. I mean, he had a lot of money,
Wow.
through which he had mainly gotten. What's
The
that?
government initially thought that he siphoned 50 million overseas, but it was closer to 75, and they captured him.
Yeah.
Oh,
And he had a lot of money. I mean, all this money that he had was
was that money in cash? Because he sold the stock?
So from stock sales, proceeds from stock sales. He made a lot of money through insider trading. And mind you, he also made a lot of money in cash that they've been trying to collect. They were trying to collect until they stopped. And sometime in the early 2000s, they just sort of gave up. I think it was 2000. They were still finding money.
Towards the end of the book, it said they were still looking today, right?
No, they stopped looking after a while. No, they're not looking anymore.
They're not looking anymore. Okay, all right, okay, cool. So eventually they find him in Israel.
Yeah.
The Israeli police arrest him, and then he's extradited to the U.S.
Yeah.
Right, and he stands trial. And Sam told him everything, so he really didn't have a leg to kind of stand on, but he fought anyway.
Oh, yeah. Well, look,
Right?
Sure, as was his right, and of course, Sam, had become over during this process, because he was betrayed by Eddie. Eddie left him hanging. Sam had no choice. This is a classic situation. When you don't treat co-conspirators correctly, they will turn against you. Maybe in fiction in the early 1900s they wouldn't. Okay, and maybe there are certain people here and there who in the history of the world, certain mobsters maybe, who no matter how badly they're treated, they don't turn informant. But 90% of the time, they'll become informant. They'll come up with an excuse to do it. That's exactly what happened with Sam. He became an informant, and boy, was he a great informant.
Yeah.
He was a terrific, and he led the government step by step through the fraud. But before that happened, he had to first convince the government that he was telling the truth. They didn't believe him.
It was the two other.
There were two
people.
other guys.
Was it Cindy or it was two other guys? I forgot their names.
Two other guys. I forgot their names.
Yeah,
It doesn't
they didn't
matter.
trust Sam.
They didn't trust Sam because the government, they had two informants. They were invested in these two informants who were like tools of the Antar family.
Right.
And they weren't telling the whole story. They were telling some of the story, but they weren't telling all the story.
Because it wasn't inside.
And it wasn't inside. And one of them, in fact, committed perjury in the course of his.
I saw that.
So one of the prosecutors involved in this big mess after the company collapsed, one of the prosecutors was really invested in these two informants and didn't think Sam was telling the truth. He had his informants. He didn't need anybody else. He had his truth. He got the truth. So he got replaced, fortunately. But until he was replaced, had that continued, and Sam might have gone to prison for 7 years, and the government would not have won a conviction off these two informants because they were lying. They were lying through their teeth. But eventually, Sam was able to convince a new prosecutor, a new set of people, and a particular FBI agent who believed him, that he was telling the truth.
Right. So eventually Eddie's convicted.
Yeah.
He does 6 years in prison. Sam kind of like gets a slap on the wrist. According to the book, not much happened. So I'm impressed that nothing happened. But I just saw all the scheming they do, and just like they let you off lightly, and like Wall Street's like something I don't know.
Well, the difference
People
was, but to be
so much
fair,
money.
to be fair to Sam, particularly since he's here, yeah, to be fair to Sam, unlike the other, unlike Eddie, he didn't engage in insider trading. You see, that's a big deal. There were other defendants, and they committed, they actually took money through securities fraud. Sam, maybe because he didn't think things through, whatever, but Sam did not profit the
Right, he
way
didn't make money.
the others did. So since he
didn't make money.
in fact, even lost some
Oh, he
stock
lost a
money
lot of
on
money, yeah.
his stock.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So
they decided, look at the way he's been helping us.
yeah,
And Judge Politan, who was the judge presiding over the case in New Jersey, tough judge, but he liked informants. See, he liked informants. And because Sam had cooperated, he agreed to the plea deal, which was, yeah, as you point out, it was a pretty light plea deal. But in order to get that plea deal, he had letters from the federal prosecutors, from every single person involved in prosecuting the fraud, private attorneys, and they read almost like reference letters to old fraternity buddies. They were so praising.
no, I mean, listen, this is Sam was the chief financial officer. He was orchestrating
Yeah.
all these frauds, and for him to become a turncoat, you got to be proud of the guy, right? Because very few who was right there orchestrating it would turn and reveal the scam
Well,
as it was. But
Yeah.
also that was his family.
What's
So
that?
that was his family. So
That was his family.
Yeah, Crazy Eddie. Eddie Ento was his family.
Yeah. Well,
So how do you see the family after all this happened? Do the family still get together, or is the ones that are still alive? In terms of this story.
I don't know if you're asking me. You're saying.
Do you know?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, maybe Sammy can answer that. Does the family still get together after so many years?
Christmas.
Every Christmas.
Yes,
Yeah. You got to remember also that Eddie was,
I'll say this to you, that the children of the conspirators, call it the next generation, it hasn't affected them.
Yeah.
It's only the adults that were
Okay.
involved. There is much more
Friction.
animosities.
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
though, like, Eddie's sister hated me, but now she's very friendly with me, things like that. And their children, the children don't, this is the silly thing that the adults did many years ago.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, all right, cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate you
Yeah.
talking about the book. I'll open up to any questions. Anybody have any questions for Gary?
Could I just comment on the Syrian community in Brooklyn? They're a
Please.
very tight-knit community. I understand if you move out of the community, you're looked down upon. Because you're supposed to stay there your whole life.
Well, that I don't know.
Kings Highway and Avenue ORS.
Mhm.
I lived in that area, and my ophthalmologist moved to Manhattan.
Uh-huh.
And his family thought it was terrible. He moved near Lincoln Center. He still had his practice on Kings Highway and East 16th Street, but his rest of the family looked, like turncoat type, very tight. That's what I understand.
Well, there's no question it's a tight-knit
Yeah.
community, and
Wealthy.
I mean, in a way, it's a good thing,
Yeah.
because look, it's how many communities out there immigrated in 1920, 1910, and still retained sort of an organic. They're still retain their values. It's a very religious community. It's very orthodox, very pro-Israel. And there's a pride in being Jewish among the Syrian Jewish community you don't have, frankly, among people in the among the Ashkenazi community, except for the Orthodox. But the assimilation, assimilation simply did not take the same form among the Syrian Jewish community as it did among Ashkenazis, and Ashkenazi meaning non-Syrians.
What prompted you to write this book?
Huh?
What prompted you to write this book?
Money? No. It was, I got the book contract, and that's how you, well, I mean, look, that's why you write a book. Why did, if anyone were to give you an honest answer, why did you write that book? Well, I got the contract, and, it's not like, the way Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, and stay in your garret, and then after you're dead, they find the manuscript. It's not the way, it doesn't work that way anymore. But,
Do you have any personal connection to the story or the people in any way?
Well, I got to know Sam through, he had contacted me when I had a blog. I actually still have the blog, but I was writing a blog in the early 2000s. Oh, actually, it was more like anyway, it was about 2007, 2008. And in my blog, I was writing about a particular scam artist named Patrick Boone. And Sam opined, and I got to know Sam through that connection. Patrick Boone is now involved in trying to overturn the 2020 election. But in those days, he was a conspiracy theorist, and he was constantly attacking the press and attacking
Is that Overstock?
critics. Yeah, Overstock. Yeah, you correct. I don't like to use the words because it makes my lips curdle when I say that.
But do you think that the approach, from the government has changed in a material way? Because just as a person who's in the finance industry, I imagine there are so many cases of this kind of Crazy Eddie situation, but the Crazy Eddie situation got the attention and got prosecuted, but there were so many other similar Crazy Eddie type schemes that were going on, and I think that things have evolved such that there are more repercussions for that kind of behavior, and I would hope so. But again, we can all be skeptical about, right, how effective our controls are in the government and how we hold people accountable. But I imagine the Crazy Eddie was sort of something where they could hold it up as a case where, hey, we're holding this person accountable, right? But and maybe things haven't changed, and it's much the same, right?
Well, we'll know in 20 years, when people start writing about the frauds that are taking place right now,
May I answer? We're living in the golden age of fraud, golden age of white-collar crime, and in New York in particular, we're living in the golden age of white-collar crime and street crime. No offense to what's going on around us, whatever.
So you're saying nothing has changed?
It's gotten worse, and I'll explain to you why. There's a college called the University of Syracuse. They come out with this thing, TRAC, T-R-A-C, and I don't remember what the acronym means, but they used to study federal prosecutions of white-collar crime. And as recently as 2 years ago, the feds were prosecuting less white-collar crimes than when I was a criminal 35 years ago. Now, how big is the economy today versus 35 years ago? Go by the stock market prices. Stock Dow's at 30,000. Maybe it was at 2,000 or 3,000 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So what's happening basically is the government is giving up on prosecuting white-collar crime. They're pretty much pushing people to the civil courts to get resolved, and it never gets resolved. And that's what we have with white-collar crime. Now we're starting to see the same thing follow in places like New York, where starting to we want less resources to fight street crime. And I can tell you that, listen, there's no accurate way to measure white-collar crime because it's not like homicides. You count dead bodies or whatever. But I can tell you, by virtue of the economy growing, white-collar crime is going to grow with the economy. And the problem that we have here is that our government has basically lost its capacity to protect its citizens from both white-collar crime and in places like New York from street crime. And it's a sad thing to watch.
Yeah, because you only know whether white-collar crime has taken place after the fact.
After the fact, yeah.
You know,
Most of
you-
these crimes have been going on for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, Bernie Madoff didn't get caught when he first started.
Yeah.
He'd been going at it for 20 years.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and it
Same
was
thing
like,
with us.
yeah, and it was all very secret, just the way Eddie was saying. Any crime that may be going on, any white-collar crime that would be going on right now is not going to advertise itself as such.
Right.
It's going to be discovered, after the shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
So that's the way it is with white-collar crime.
Yeah, and by the time you get to them, sometimes the person, like towards the end of your book, you indicate that some of those crimes never got prosecuted
Yes.
by what Crazy Eddie was doing.
Part
So
of-
those
part of the
early
pro-
years,
Part of the problem is our system of justice, okay? We have probably the greatest system of justice in the world. And what's the key part of it? You're innocent until you're proven guilty. So the government can't really be that proactive when it comes to crime unless there's
Proof.
reasonable cause or something like that. But
Yeah.
it's not that easy to get.
All right.
People think that the government can just tap your phone. They can't do it that way. Yeah, sometimes it happens. There's always abuse. There's always outliers. But in the case of white-collar crime, how is the government is not going to come into my apartment and pull my hard drive because they believe or they think that I'm committing a crime. So the criminal justice system, by and large, protects the criminals more than the victims. We don't have a system of justice in America. We have a legal system, which is far different. The legal system got me off with a slap on the wrist. The system of justice would have said 10 years, 15
10
years.
years, yeah, right.
Well, as you mentioned, as I pointed out, the majority of the crimes that Eddie committed, that Eddie Antar committed, which included, we didn't even get into it, there were so many, insurance fraud on a widespread scale, warranty fraud on a way, that was a big money maker, things like this. He never got prosecuted, and he never was punished, or the
Never
sales
got
tax
prosecuted for
fraud.
income tax evasion.
Income tax evasion.
Yeah.
The income tax evasion through the skimmed money, the stealing of sales tax, none of that ever resulted in a prosecution. In fact, one of the ironies is that one of his competitors, who had this squeaky clean reputation, he got
Lewis.
Newmark and Lewis, Big Lewis,
Yeah.
squeaky clean reputation. Dick Lewis is watching. He used to have these TV commercials.
Yeah.
He was prosecuted for insurance fraud. It didn't get very much attention. This happened many years later, but he wound up getting prosecuted. I described what was going on in behind the scenes of Crazy Eddie, how they used to commit insurance fraud. But and the government knew about that. The prosecutors knew about that. But first of all, they had to sort of decide. They sort of had to pick through the ruins of Crazy Eddie, decide what they were going to prosecute, and also they didn't necessarily have the ability to prosecute all that stuff because they just didn't have this enough witnesses, enough. They couldn't really do a prosecution. It's one thing for me to write about it. It's another thing for them to prosecute.
Yeah. It takes evidence. And workers to get that evidence.
Yeah.
So my last question is, Sam M. He didn't get charged with nothing.
No, he got sued a lot. He got sued by everybody, and his cash.
Remember O.J. Simpson? What was O.J. Simpson in the end, right? He was acquitted on criminal charges, convicted on civil charges.
Yeah, but Sam M was
You kind
never.
of call Sam M. Antar, Eddie's brother Alan, that was acquitted in the criminal trial,
Yeah.
and Ben Kuza, the O.J. Simpson of securities.
Yeah.
In other words, they were either not indicted or acquitted in various in criminal cases, right? They were either not indicted or acquitted, but they were stupid enough to go to trial with the SEC in the civil case.
Yeah, Sam.
The SEC,
yeah.
this Judge Ackerman issued this 200 or so page opinion, really detailing all the other stuff that they couldn't do in the criminal case. Because again, our our so-called criminal justice system, which is a legal system, you have a very high bar. It's kind of like you got to be 99% right to get a criminal conviction, but a civil conviction, all you have to do is be 51% right.
Yeah, and Sam M never got
Evidence of evidence versus
yeah.
beyond the reasonable doubt.
and Sam M never went on trial criminally. He was never criminally
Right,
charged.
He went on trial civilly.
Yeah, he just went on trial
He
civilly.
was
yeah.
on trial
The fact that
civilly.
he brought it to a trial with the SEC
Yeah.
and there was a judgment against him made Gary libel proof. writing about
Well-
the fraud because there was already a court decision on it.
There were tons
Finding
and
of fact.
tons and tons of paperwork generated through the various litigation. You know, this decision, you know, Judge Ackerman, who issued the decision that Sam mentioned on Sam M. Antar and Alan Antar and whoever the hell
Mitchell,
else,
right?
Mitchell,
Mitchell
and all that, a whole bunch. That page, it was 200 page, I think it was. I think that's what it was. Huge decisions. There were reams and reams of judges' decisions, plus testimony. Just the entire trial transcript was about 1,000 pages. There were depositions after depositions after depositions. You know, and that's the interesting thing I think about the Eddie Antar story is that you know his story is told through the people, and their stories are told through paper. You know, through testimony. You know, not through people, not through recollections, but through what came out at the time.
What came out at the time.
Yeah.
No, it's great. No, great book, Gary. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Great talk. Yeah. And there's books available for sale, and Gary will sign them for you.
Sure.